Hello and welcome. My name is Victoria Tomoka Countryman. I'm a second-year student here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. I'm also a junior editor for the Utah Law Review. I will be serving as the moderator for this panel, and the title of this panel is Overcoming the Resistance to DEI. Our panelists today are Dr. Robin Boylorn, Thomas Donnelly, and Dr. Robert Rosante. Dr. Robin Boylorn is a professor of interpersonal and intercultural communication in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Alabama. Her research and writing focuses on issues of social identity and diversity with an emphasis on social justice and advocacy. She is the author of the award-winning monograph Sweetwater, Black Women and Narratives of Resilience, co-editor of Critical Autoethnography, Intersecting Cultural Identities in Everyday Life, and co-writer and editor of the Crunk Feminist Collection. Her public writing and cultural commentary has been published in venues, including Slate, Ebony, The Guardian, Salon, Gawker, and the Crunk Feminist Collective blog. She is also a commentator for Alabama Public Radio and editor-elect of the journal Communication and Critical Cultural Studies. Thomas Donnelly has practiced environmental and insurance coverage law for more than 30 years. He represents clients in environmental litigation and regulatory enforcement proceedings, provides compliance counseling and due diligence transactional support, and assists clients in securing coverage from their insurers. Tom's clients have included energy, oil and gas and mining companies, technology companies, aerospace, engineering and construction companies, automotive equipment and consumer product manufacturers, retailers, financial institutions, and real property owners and developers. He has appeared in all federal district courts in California, the 9th and 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, in California trial and appellate courts. Dr. Robert Rosante received his PhD from the Hugh Downs School of Human Communication at Arizona State University. His engaged scholarship seeks to transform conflicts surrounding the intersections of culture, privilege, and marginalization. Rob's dissertation research is with a multinational healthcare organization desiring a more inclusive workplace for their caregivers. The study uses interpretive structural modeling to offer suggestions for organizational leaders when allocating resources for building inclusion. We will be having a Q&A session following this discussion. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time during the discussion. And so to start things off, the first topic we'd like to hear from the panelists about focus on whether law school is the right place to be having this conversation about DEI. This is mostly directed towards Dr. Boylorn and Dr. Rosante, and also discussing whether class time should be devoted to educating students on the importance of DEI and why this matters.
Thank you, Victoria. Rob, I want to invite you to start.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I think the question, taking a look at the question of if it's the right place or not, makes it seem as if DEI is optional work. Like it's optionally something we can include. But the question opposite, like what happens if we don't talk about DEI? What does that do? And I believe that works to sustain what already exists. And I believe what already exists may not be equitable, may not be thriving for what we want to do in terms of incorporating diversity and weaving diversity throughout who we are as a country, as a world at that point. So I think the question of, all right, so is it the right place? Yes, it is the right place. And then just a matter of like, all right, so how do we start weaving this into curricula? How do we weave this into the classroom? So I believe, yeah, it is the right place. And with our questions later in the session, I have a few recommendations or maybe some other areas that we can go into of how to actually make this happen.
Right, I want to echo that. I think that law school is absolutely the right place, and in many ways, I would say the necessary place to have this conversation. When we think about the lack of engagement of diversity, or the way in which diversity has always been attended to in many classroom contexts outside of disciplines that are specific to diversity, as an add-on, as an addendum, as something that you might review at the end of the course, or something that there might be a chapter dedicated to that at the end of the textbook. But I think it's really important, particularly and most vitally in law school, that it becomes something that's embedded into the curriculum, something that law school should be a place where these questions are being asked, where these ideas are being engaged, because future lawyers are going to they're going to be the mouthpiece and the representatives of justice for people of color and marginalized communities that don't have a voice of their own. So if we're training future lawyers, right, about how to seek justice, we need to also explain to them and help them understand that justice doesn't look the same for everybody. And even though, there is the saying that justice is blind, it is not, right? It's not blind or colorblind. And so knowing that to be the historical truth, how can we make it so that these conversations don't feel extra, added on, or laborious, right? Like what would it mean for it to be not just a class, but a part of every class that you take? What would it mean to have this conversation at every level of education in law school? And how could that shape shift how we think about social justice and how we engage with the people in which you would be dealing with as clients and community members?
I'll answer the question, why does it matter? I've been practicing law for 33 years now. So I graduated from law school in 1988. And the only class I recall that even touched on this issue was constitutional law, when we talked about affirmative action, and that was it. Otherwise, it was not part of the law school curriculum to address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It hardly mattered, it seemed, to those who were putting the curriculum together. There were organizations that focused on this, and you could pursue internships and do work for legal aid and other groups that tried to address these issues, but it was not part of the education, the formal education. So why does it matter? So I'm going to share with you some statistics that I gathered from the ABA and NALP. You probably are all familiar with NALP as you consider applying for jobs. Since 2000, 46% of law school graduates have been women, 46 to 50% since 2000. Yet here are the numbers for women in law firms. In 2000, 42% of associates were women, so close to the graduation rate. Yet only 16% were partners. In 2006, 44% of associates were women, 18% were partners, so slight improvement. In 2008, 45% of associates were women. Again, that's lined up with the number of graduates. Just 19% were partners. In 2019, it's 45% of associates were women, and only 23% were partners. And of those 23%, roughly half, or 12%, were equity partners. And what that means is they were part owners of the firms. A non-equity partner is really no different than a senior associate. They get paid a set compensation and don't share in the profits of the firm. And so it's a big difference in terms of compensation and stature in law firms. Ethnically diverse women currently make up just 3% of all law firm partners. And Black and Asian American women partners are just 0.75%, and Latinx women partners are just 0.8%. Those are the current figures, as of 2019. So those are the data on women in law firms. Now, diverse lawyers, it's even worse. So ethnically diverse law school graduates since 2000 are 20 to 31%. And there's a range because of how what's the definition of diverse in compiling that data. So 20 to 31% of law school graduates since 2000 are ethnically diverse. Here are the numbers, though, in law firms. In 2000, 13% of associates were diverse. Only 3% were partners. In 2006, that number went up to 16% for associates, 5% for partners. In 2008, it went up to 19% for associates, just 6% for partners. And as of 2019, 25% of associates are diverse, so that's in line with the graduation rate, yet only 10% are partners, 4% are equity partners. So the numbers are still dismal. Corporate law departments are doing better, not much better, but they're doing better. So why does this matter? It matters because as you consider careers, especially careers in law firms or in corporate legal departments, there are significant challenges. Those who are diverse, those who are not white men like me, face significant challenges still today. And part of the problem is that law firms and GCs are primarily still white men of my generation who haven't experienced what diverse lawyers and women lawyers have experienced. And I think that's the key. And that's what we need to address.
Yeah, to add to that, Tom, so it's the conversation of, all right, within the legal field, there's all this data that suggests that it's very exclusive. And for students who want to develop their own firm in the future, if potential clients are looking at what a typical lawyer looks like, then we need to prepare our students to be able to deal with that prejudice, that bias. So I believe it helps to increase the representation. Robin, I know your work talks a lot about representation, how representation can really matter here, especially when students are creating their own firms. All right, how do we create this image or this representation of what lawyers can look like, what attorneys can look like with diverse representation, so that when people are looking for potential lawyers, it's a wider option in terms of maybe people who can represent you, who have similar experiences, or maybe can really relate to those experiences. So right. It's also within the field, but then also preparing students for their futures.
Absolutely. And that also makes me think about how, the ways in which it makes me wonder who's in the actual classroom, right? Because sometimes when we think about diversity, if it's not embedded in the curriculum, it only often comes up if there's a marginalized person in the room, right? And they bring it up and they bring that part into the conversation. And so if they're absent, right? So we're thinking about not just representation in terms of like the cases and the things that they're looking at, right? And the artifacts, but also representation in who's in the classroom and representation in who is teaching the class. Because I think that those biases are consistent across the board. And then it does then bleed into the actual practice of law when kind of as Tom was saying, if there is a preference or privilege to white maleness, and that's what a lawyer looks like, right? Like I get this sometimes as a Black woman professor. I'm not what a professor, what students expect a professor to look like. And that can sometimes jeopardize your credibility. And so then it jeopardizes your competitiveness once you do have a firm, right? And so thinking about, do firms that have majority people of color or majority women, right? Do they have the same opportunity, to attract clients that a firm that has, only lawyers that look like lawyers that are available in terms of who's representing them.
Thank you so much for all of your comments on that. And that kind of leads us perfectly to this next area that we'd like to address, which is kind of taking a step back just from law school in the classroom, but really having a discussion about what challenges the legal community as a whole faces in terms of this area of DEI and what efforts they are making and should be making to improve in this area.
So I'll start on this, and I have although Victoria's description of my practice focus didn't indicate this, I've been a hiring partner in my firm for years. I've been actively involved in recruiting efforts and retention efforts. Also have developed programs where we do outreach to diverse law students, provide mentoring opportunities, which I'll get to in a minute. So I've been heavily involved in this effort to broaden the base, to broaden the base of lawyers that work in our profession. And the key to me is, on the one hand, we can and we do, and I'm saying we as law firms generally can and do attract and hire diverse and women lawyers. As the data I indicated to you before indicate, the number of associates who are women or diverse are pretty close to the percentage that graduate from law school. So we're able to hire diverse and women lawyers, but we're not able to keep them. That's the key. So how do we retain and promote women and diverse lawyers? And that's a question that law firms and corporate legal departments have been asking for at least 20 years now. And the answer is clear to me, but accomplishing it is not so clear. And we need to provide mentors to women and diverse lawyers, and mentors that have had similar experiences. So I act as a mentor, and I'm heavily involved in a program that's nationwide now. It's the LCLD program, Leadership Council on Legal Diversity, formed by law firms and GCs. This goes back at least 20 years as well. And I have a mentor, a diverse mentor every year. So I've mentored at least 8 lawyers in law school, and I've provided them with advice on their resumes and interviewing and how to strategize about the classes they take and what job opportunities they pursue. But I'm doing it as a white man, and I'm trying my best to be supportive, but I've not experienced what, obviously I can't have experienced what a woman has experienced growing up or in law school, or how she feels, nor the same for a diverse candidate. And what we see in our firm, and I saw in my former firm as well, is that the women and diverse lawyers who become partners had women and diverse mentors who were partners, almost without exception. It was just critically important to their feeling like they belonged, like someone had similar experiences and can guide them through some of the challenges they faced. So we need to have more women and diverse partners, but to get there, we've got to retain the women and diverse associates that we hire. So until that occurs, and there's been some progress, but it's been really slow. But until that occurs, I think we're going to continue to face this challenge. So how do we, find mentors who can really relate to diverse and women lawyers? That's the key challenge. I'll pause there before talking about what efforts can and should be made, just to give Rob and Robin a chance to comment on that.
I appreciate that context, Tom, because I was thinking about that, right? And even there are similar challenges, I think, within academia, because most of my mentors were white men, right? But they were very progressive white men that helped, that encouraged me, and were really committed to the things that the structures that were in place to make things difficult for me. They were really intentional about knocking those things down on my behalf, which was really helpful. But one of the things that I've learned as I have moved into a position of senior leadership, even as a professor, is the importance of my visibility to future professors, right? And so I imagine it is the same with lawyers, because there's a way in which you can mentor, because you can mentor anyone about the steps that they need to take, but it would take someone with that unique lived experience to mentor them about how to do that while also navigating racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, like classism, right? And so someone who can have those very frank conversations with them about imposter syndrome and the inevitable inequities that they're going to have to figure out how to navigate in order to be successful. And it's really hard to do that because my mentors could prepare me. They could teach me how to be a professor, how to be a professional, how to be a scholar. They couldn't teach me how to absorb the discrimination that I was going to experience because they hadn't experienced that. So I think that's a really important point. And this may be my ignorance because, of course, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm wondering if recruitment, if when you think about recruitment within the field of law, if that includes recruiting senior partners from other firms, and this may be dicey, right? But what would that look like to, incorporate people who are who can come to a firm, an existing firm with that kind of experience, because they could then attract and show incoming lawyers and future lawyers what's possible, because it's like their visibility in a position of power makes me feel like it's possible for me. If I don't see them there, I think that may be where the retention problem is, right? Because if I'm in a firm, but I'm the only one, if I'm the token person of color and there's nobody in a position of power, I'm assuming that's not possible for me here. So I'm just going to do it. I'm going to grind it out here, and then I'm going to go somewhere else. Does that make sense?
It does. And because there are so few equity partners at firms who are women and diverse, it's very hard to recruit them. But that would be ideal, yes, because then you have the mentors in place. And I am empathetic to the concerns, and I do my best to be sensitive to them and to guide women and diverse mentees that I mentor. But there's, as you noted, Robin, there's a limit to what I can really, truly understand because I haven't had that experience.
Right. But an acknowledgement of it goes so far. Allies can create opportunities that are so important. And white allyship is so important for that reason, right? Because there are just doors you're going to be able to get to that other people wouldn't, that you can still open and bring me into. And that, kind of compensates for some of the lack of lived experience, the acknowledgement that we have a different experience, right? Because some people will say, no, it's all the same. But when there's an acknowledgement that there's a deficiency and there's a distance and there's a difference, then you can try to accommodate that to make it more equitable. It's people who ignore the difference that make it more difficult. I'm going to hush. Rob.
Yeah. I love the recommendations of mentoring, of developing this interpersonal empathy. And I don't have the experience of a legal program. However, I do also believe that there's, whatever the context is, if we have access to positions of power and privilege, there's things that we can do at the interpersonal level. We can do things at the programmatic level. We can do things at like the policy, like a larger cultural level. And I'm just curious, like, Tom, you might get to this with maybe some of the recommendations that you're going to offer here soon, but I'm curious, like, in addition to mentoring, in addition to the interpersonal empathy, like, what are things that law programs can do at the programmatic level? Like maybe offering these groups or these maybe mentoring programs, kind of like you're talking about, Tom, but then even at like the policy level or like the funding level. Makes me think back to the last conversation, the last panel, a panelist was talking about, if you're interested in DEI, where's the money going? Is the money going into that? So rather than just saying, oh, we're interested in DEI, it's like, well, we have to back that up through funding. So I'm curious, in a position, especially in an organizational position where we have access to resources, or we have access to people who can make decisions, like what are other ways that we can also contribute to promoting DEI through resources, through funding, through whatever programming it might be? But so Tom, I'm curious, like what are some of the other suggestions that you have coming up?
That was a great segue, Rob, and we didn't rehearse any of this. We met, by email, and we had one call to go over how to use Zoom and not totally mess it up. But we didn't have a substantive prep session, so that was a great segue. So I'll share with you what I've also gathered that corporate legal departments are doing, and then what law firms are doing. So there are carrots and sticks. And you're saying funding and resources. So corporate legal departments, these are the clients of law firms or the companies that law firms would like to represent. So big corporations with all their problems and all the issues about corporate America, big corporations have a big role to play in this because they drive the legal spend. Law firms want to be hired by these companies, and therefore these companies can have a huge influence. So I'll give you a couple of examples of carrots and then sticks. So Microsoft gives a 2% bonus to law firms that meet diversity goals that Microsoft has set. Overall, they are expecting a 30% increase in the percentage of hours worked by diverse attorneys. So firms that meet that get a 2% bonus from Microsoft. PepsiCo scores and ranks its outside counsel's diversity efforts, and the top ranking firms get a spot on their preferred counsel list, and they're honored at Pepsi's campus for a day. And that may seem a little trite, but that's face time with decision makers within the company for outside counsel. So those are two examples of carrots that Microsoft and Pepsi use. Sticks. I find these really interesting. So Hewlett Packard withholds up to 10% of the legal fees it would otherwise pay outside counsel who fail to meet their diversity and inclusion requirements. MetLife requires underperforming firms, and again, they have criteria to determine this, to create a diversity and inclusion action plan with their general counsel. And failure to remedy their results in losing the firm's spot on their outside counsel list. And then there are collaborative approaches, so a mix. Starbucks has a diversity mentorship program that connects Starbucks in-house lawyers with private practice junior lawyers from diverse backgrounds. Mass Mutual hosts dinners for diverse attorneys from its outside firms and company leaders, creating what they call skip-level interactions and providing valuable key contacts on both ends. So these are some of the things that corporate legal departments are doing. And law firms pay a lot of attention to this. I've been involved in lots of responses to requests for proposal. So often corporations or other prospective clients will go out to firms and ask for a proposal for how the firm would represent the company in litigation or in a deal, and to put together a plan of action and staffing, and then hourly rates or alternative fee arrangements. The staffing becomes really important because without exception now, this is in every request for proposal I've seen in the last 10 years, they are expecting women and diverse lawyers to be part of the staffing. So corporations have a big role to play in this. Some of them have stepped up, not all of them have, but those that have gotten law firms' attention. I was going to move to what law firms can and should do, but should we pause there? Because it's really a different set of things law firms are doing. Should we pause there, Robin and Rob, if you want to say anything about corporate America's role in this before
I'm taking notes. I think this is amazing. And I wish that there was more visibility of those efforts, like PR of those efforts, because I think about how important and heartening it is to know that, because corporate America can seem so heartless and dissonant, right? So to know that they're putting their money where their mouth is and prioritizing it in that way is really encouraging. So I'm just taking notes. I don't have anything to say other than yes to this.
Yeah, likewise. And just to highlight some of the, maybe taking a step back and looking at the conversation of, well, carrots and sticks. Mm-hmm. Carrots as a reward, stick as a punishment, and recognizing how different corporations may operate. They may not do something because they believe it's the right thing to do, but if they come down with penalties or sticks in this case, then maybe that does increase some action. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to keep in mind, like, well, what motivates these different firms? What motivates these different corporations to do this work, and then respond accordingly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think the biggest motivator for the corporations is that their legal departments are more diverse and have more women than law firms. I didn't share with you the numbers because I thought that was taking too long, but the corporate legal departments are doing a better job. Their percentages on all measures are up above the law firms. And so I think part of it is that the general counsel's departments at these big companies more reflect, it's not aligned, but it's closer, the law school graduates and the pool of junior lawyers, and they're more sensitive to it. And plus they have shareholders and they have to answer to shareholders and board members, and this is definitely, there's more conversation about this, thus this symposium. So I feel better about what corporate America is attempting to do. And I think law firms are trying, some better than others, but our results are not nearly as good. And I think it's because of the mentoring gap. Okay, so what are law firms doing? So I'm going to share with you what my firm has done and what I've done personally. And I think this is true of a lot of big law firms. So it's pretty common for law firms to offer to sit on panels that are created by law schools that address these issues. It's very common for us to do that. So we work very closely, for example, with Berkeley Law School. I'm based in San Francisco. We work very closely with Berkeley Law School that will put on panels that address DEI issues, and will serve as panelists. We go to receptions that groups formed on campus will host, will sponsor those events. I mean, it was really nice before COVID. We would go on campus and there'd be a big event and we would talk about these issues, and then we would meet students, they would meet lawyers. When it came time to interview on campus, we recognized them. It definitely opened doors, and there are lawyers we ended up hiring that we met at one or more panel discussions or events that we attended that addressed DEI issues. I mentioned the LCLD program, the mentoring program that was created by the Leadership Council on Legal Diversity. And my firm is a sponsor of LCLD, as are many large firms. And I have a mentee almost every year. And so that's probably the thing I'm most proud of, and I think is most impactful, because it's a direct one-on-one relationship with a law student starting in his or her first year through law school and beyond. So I've mentored 8 mentees, as I mentioned, and I'm still in touch with 3 of them, and they're well into their careers. But while they were in law school, I helped them put their resumes together. We did mock interviews. I helped them strategize about law school classes they should consider taking given their career objectives, and then where to focus their interviewing with their application and interviewing efforts. I made calls for them if I had contacts at companies or other law firms, and I remain a mentor to them. Even one woman's been practicing for 15 years now, and when she is considering a job change, we talk. And then we have another big program called SEO is the acronym. It's Sponsors for Educational Opportunity. And for the law students who are attending this symposium, I encourage you to consider that program. You apply when you're in law school, well, I'm sorry, it's too late for you. You apply when you're in college. Or before you go to law school, because you work the summer before you begin law school, you work at a law firm to get a sense of what it's like to be at a law firm. So this is a program for college graduates who are about to start law school, to give them exposure to what it's like to work in a firm. And so this SEO program, Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, we've done this for at least 10 years, and we have lawyers here at our firm that started in that program. So those are the major efforts, Rob and Robin, that corporations and law firms are making.
I love that.
I definitely think that that's such an important part of the conversation, especially for those of us who are still in law school, to have this perspective and kind of reality check of this is the world we are going to be dealing with and entering into. And so thank you so much, Tom, for laying that foundation of what's happening on the corporate level, what's happening in terms of law firms, because that kind of then leads us back to where we started with, which is with this emphasis on law schools and DEI in the classroom. And so the next thing that we'd like to discuss is what does including DEI in the classroom specifically look like? And then on two sides of this, what does it look like for students? What should they expect? And also what faculty should expect from students when these topics are getting introduced in the classroom?
Yeah, I believe in taking a look at the classroom. The classroom has a lot of different layers to it. So if we're trying to learn up here through like concepts and terms, maybe we need to rework some of the readings or maybe some of the cases that we're analyzing. But then there's also like a layer of, all right, when you're in the classroom, maybe you can use that as a space for practicing. So like communication is a practice phenomenon, like a practice discipline. So like, how do we change to become better communicators? How do we become better listeners, better analyzers of messages? So the classroom itself, the lessons or the sessions that we have could be geared toward, all right, you're in this situation and somebody makes this homophobic comment. What do you do? Like respond to it. And then in that case, you could do some coaching. So professors could do some coaching of saying, all right, well, consider this as a potential outcome of that. Well, if you do that, maybe you're going to get this discrimination where you might even lose your job. All right, how do we deal with that? Or maybe you say, great. Yeah, that's a great way of responding. Maybe consider this argument. So there's, the readings we could do. There's the time we use in class could be used toward rehearsing maybe how to actually respond to prejudice messages. But then I'm even thinking like classes in general. So maybe there's classes where you take like a research methods approach kind of to it. But I'm thinking of one in particular that would be particularly helpful for the legal field, and it's called discourse tracing. And discourse tracing is a way of looking at how micro level communication, so like what we're doing right now, we're talking at this micro level, how that could trickle up into policy, or how it trickles up into decisions like making programs or allocating resources, and then even trickles up into law. But then it also looks at how does law trickle down into the way that we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I believe a research methods that focuses on how is it that communication trickles up and trickles down would be particularly helpful, especially if we want to change the way that the legal field does DEI. It could be a great way of tracing how it's been created up to this point, and then looking for ways to maybe rework it moving forward.
I love that. And when I'm thinking about including DEI in the classroom, what that looks like, I also think about what does the classroom look like? Who is in the room? Who's not in the room? And how is that accounted for? And, so I think about the ways in which there has to be a lot of intentionality there. So I think about even in terms of who the students are, right? There has to be some intentionality so that there's not a token diverse person in the room that everybody kind of, looks at when a question comes up, but more so that there is intentionality about recruiting cohorts together, recruiting students together so that they can go through the process together. And I'm not implying that all diverse people and all diverse groups are homogenous and we'll get along and we'll like each other and we'll study together. I just mean that there is safety in having another person in the room, right? Not being the only woman in the room, the only woman of color in the room, the only first generation person in the room, right? And because that to me, that's what a diverse a DEI classroom looks diverse, right? It's not just in what you're talking about or what you're studying or what you're reading, but who you're in conversation with and how. It might also mean that you're inviting diverse and women lawyers, practitioners, professors, social justice, activists into the room as guest lecturers to kind of talk about those experiences, bring the experiences in the room that aren't there, make sure that as many experiences as possible are represented, and then create, and then the art is in creating a space that is conducive to learning about these things. And the thing that I always tell my students when they're taking a class with me, I teach a class called Communication and Diversity. And so the thing that I tell them up front is, if you're not uncomfortable at some point during this class, you're not doing it right. Because these things are thinking about and engaging with diversity is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be, right? It's part of the process. So I think that one of the things that faculty should expect when they introduce these things is resistance, defensiveness, discomfort, anger, right? Like this roller coaster of emotions over the course of what you're learning. It's oftentimes probably some ambivalence, but then at the end, they should expect some transformation. They should expect some revelation. It may not happen until the end of the course. It may not even happen until like a year after the course, right? I've had students email me later and say, oh, okay, you were right? Like, I get I thought it was BS, but you were right. And so I think that planting those seeds and creating those opportunities for people to be uncomfortable, for students to be uncomfortable and being comfortable with that. Get used to it. We live in a pluralistic society. You're not going to be able to just engage with people who agree with you. So, I know that one of the things communicatively that's happening in a law school classroom is debate, right? And so how do we kind of facilitate that specifically around diversity, right? So that we can hold our own feelings, but also attend to the feelings of other people. And relatedly, I would say, because the other part of the question was, what can I think that what students can expect and what faculty can expect are similar in that this resistance, defensiveness, and all of that. But I think that students should expect to have a much more rich and dynamic educational experience, because a lack of diversity and a lack of engaging what it's going to be like when you're actually out practicing law in the real world is not going to be as beneficial as you may think. So I don't think that we should aim for classrooms that make students comfortable. I think we should aim for classroom conversations that make them uneasy and that give them something to think about when they walk outside of the room. Take these conversations that are happening in the room, in the classroom, out to the kitchen table, right? To the living room, to the boardroom, to the courtroom, right?
And isn't that provocative though? To make students feel a little uneasy when we want to be comfortable. And it makes me think back to the last panel when one of the panelists was talking about mindfulness. Mm-hmm. So mindfulness isn't really talking about DEI at all, but Robin, going what you're talking about, it's part of the process, It's not something that you just get after a class, but what is the process when you are provoked by something? It's kind of like when we're like shook up, like this little snow globe ball. Mm-hmm. But before we can even talk about difference, we need to first recognize how to become more still and present with what's going on before we can actually start making change internally. Mm-hmm. So yeah, mindfulness would be another thing that we could focus on as a part of the process to move to a conversation where people aren't just sharing media bites or sharing something that's coming from maybe messages that their mentors who have participated in exclusionary practices have told them to then share. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a lot of different parts of this process that by the time students can leave class, maybe they start to become a little bit more mindful, a little bit more on the path toward DEI.
And if I can ask, this isn't one of our questions, but we're going with the flow. If I can ask Tom about like what this kind of looks like in practice, have you had, particularly some of the lawyers that you have mentored, like how do they navigate these things in a real life context if it's never been introduced in the classroom? assuming it has not?
Yeah, I've had some pretty difficult, not personally difficult, but one mentee in particular shared with me what she experienced. I mean, just blatant racism in the interview process. I mean, she felt it, and it was quite clear to her. And this is where there was a limit to what there was a limit to what I could advise her, other than to try to connect with another woman of color who could share with her how she addressed that. So the advice I give is to express, I missed the first session, but I'm very familiar with mindfulness, right? It's to raise the issue, make sure she's being honest about what occurred and how she feels about it, and then to figure out a way, if there is a way, to address it directly or in some other manner. And she ended up, of course, not pursuing that job. She did write a letter, though, which I suggested she do, to the head of the recruiting department at this firm, and they did respond to her and they apologized to her. So she did address it, but then she was just, that was always in the back of her mind, and it was really hard for her to feel confident going into this process. But she didn't give up, and I was really, that's what I suggested, that she not give up, pursuing a law firm career, because she thought maybe I should just go to a nonprofit, maybe I should go in-house, which you'll hear a lot to those who are attending, who are students. You may hear that, if you may get that advice, and I think that's the wrong advice. Actually, I think you gather the support you need and you pursue your career objective. But anyway, there was a limit to what I could do. I think what I suggested was the right thing to do, but she ended up working through this by having other women of color advise her on how to address this, how to anticipate and address the issues that she faced. It's clear to me that she didn't get the job she wanted because she was a Black woman, and it's really sad, but that was clear to me what was occurring.
I think right there is another reason why it should show up in the classroom.
Absolutely. I just think, based on my upbringing and my I am pretty empathetic. I think it came naturally to me to be sensitive to this, even though I grew up in a town where there was one Black family and there was one Jewish family. It was all white, Catholic, and Protestant families. I wasn't exposed to any real diversity until I went to college and law school, and then I moved to California. So I think inherently I was sensitive, but unfortunately, a lot of people aren't. And so the more this discussion occurs in law school and in other settings, the more, you're all going to be sensitized to it. And soon you will be the leaders of corporate legal departments and law firms and nonprofits. And, you are the future of the profession. And if you're having this discussion now and throughout law school and beyond, things should improve. I hope we've seen some improvement. It just hasn't been fast enough.
And that also makes me think about, this experience that she had, and how I'm glad that the HR department, that they responded, that the hiring department responded. But it also makes me wonder how conscious the panelists were that they were being racist. Racism is so ubiquitous, right? It's so embedded into everything, that I think oftentimes, because another thing that can happen in the DEI classroom is creating space, kind of like Rob was saying, where there are these opportunities for these teaching moments, these opportunities for reflection and correction in the moment, because oftentimes students they don't realize they're being racist, right? So you need to have a space where you can say, that's racist, or let's talk about that. And then help them unpack it, because I think that there is oftentimes more unconscious, ubiquitous racism than intentional racism. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because if people think that they're being fair, they're being equitable, right? Like they gave this person a chance, their credentials just aren't the same. But when you look at the full context and measure of it, what opportunities did this white candidate have that this Black woman candidate didn't have? And if you take that privilege away, now look at it. Is it still as disparate as it seems? And, so I think kind of coaching people and teaching them what racism looks like in an everyday context, because if they just think, well, I didn't call her an N-word, this wasn't a racist exchange. It's just, I feel like people really need to understand the nuances and microaggressions of racism that happen in those contexts.
Yeah, the questions she was asked, a white man would not have been asked. She was asked, for how long do you expect to work in a law firm? And do you see yourself moving on after a couple of years to a nonprofit? A white man is not asked these questions. So the interviewer, who was a white man, made these assumptions about her as a woman and a Black woman. Right. And that was inappropriate. I mean, those are inappropriate questions to ask. In my opinion, they're inappropriate.
Yes.
You evaluate the candidate, you see if the candidate is genuinely interested. I mean, those are appropriate questions, but he pigeonholed her.
Yes.
In a racist way.
Yes.
I wanted to pause there just to make sure if there was anything else the panelists wanted to say in regards to students, because turning this kind of final topic that we wanted to address here with this panel, with overcoming resistance to DEI, is more geared towards faculty and to teachers, professors. What are your suggestions for the best way faculty can communicate in this space? And what in particular are effective pointers you have for communicating around DEI in the law?
I think that Rob had some pointers prepared. I think that the only thing that I would say, and then I want to pass the baton to Rob, is that, it's really important for faculty to be truth tellers, right? And to do that, even when it is inconvenient, telling the inconvenient truths, the uncomfortable truths, the vulnerable truths, and the, and I also think that being transparent as a faculty member about your own biases and how you overcame them, that kind of transparency is what becomes helpful, right? I have often had I have taught classes wherein I was like, this is rehab for all of us, right? Like, I am racist, or I have internalized racism. I have this problem and I'm going to work on it this semester. And let's all say that, like, I am racist, I am sexist, I am ableist, I am, just kind of owning the ways that even if you identify as an ally, there have been moments and situations where you've gotten it wrong. So I think that faculty need to tell the truth, and they also just need to have grace. I think it's really important that we not be on a soapbox and act as if we've always got it right all the time. We're all learning, and it is an ongoing process that even faculty participate in the classroom space, in terms of learning how to engage these things and learning how to do it right, and getting, and kind of and figuring out how to fix it when you get it wrong, right? There will be times when everybody messes up, including faculty. How do we fix it and keep it going? How do we just correct it and keep moving instead of getting stuck, right?
Yeah, and to build on that, with faculty, with professors, of also recognizing, when we do get it wrong as faculty, as mentors, as professors, and there is that internal work that we should do, especially if we've been mentored by people who may not be familiar with DEI or may not advocate it. In a way, we're starting to form these muscles for how we then act or how we then teach.
Mm-hmm.
And Loretta Lermaster at Arizona State University brought up this term of rolfing. And it's this like violent process that people do But rolfing is when you take your skeleton, your bones, and your muscles form. So for example, I have a bad problem of leaning forward sometimes, but what starts to happen is my muscles form so that I start leaning forward. And then we keep practicing every day of leaning forward. That reinforces that bad posture. But rolfing is when you take the muscles that have formed over time and you tear the connective tissue and you reformulate, you replace them so that you can start building back that posture. So for the inner work that we're doing, yes, taking that self-reflective look like Tom was doing, where we grew up, where are these educational spaces that we've been in, where are these mentoring spaces that we've been in that have formed these habits? And how can we start to tear that connective tissue to try to reform them ourselves before we try to, or as we're trying to help students do that work on their own too. There's definitely that process, going back to what Robin's saying, it's the process. It's not just something that we do and we're done with it. And it can be painful. I imagine rolfing is very painful, but I imagine this whole process is painful for ourselves too.
Okay, I think then we are going to transition into answering some of the questions posed by those who are in the audience at the moment. And the first one that I thought we might briefly spend time addressing has to do with this question of how do we avoid promoting a white savior complex when teaching DEI in a predominantly undiverse setting?
Yeah. I appreciate this question because it's going back to Robin, what you're talking about with the unconscious, like we unconsciously promote racism or classism or homophobia. So the unconscious part of it. And oftentimes when we do become conscious, we're like, all right, you want to make change. And sometimes making that change goes to actually doing things that can actually reinforce what you're trying to work against. So I believe coming from a place of not being conscious to a place of consciousness, it's like we go to the extreme and we do things like the white savior complex, where we are trying to act without really consulting with people who would be impacted by our actions. So I believe that consulting is very important, but then also getting a greater understanding of the different ways to act, of different ways to respond. So yeah, once we become conscious, there's things that we can do internally, like recognizing our own privilege or practicing self-reflexivity. There's things we can do in terms of our families or our friend group of having conversations. And it can even work its way up to, all right, how do we get involved in terms of voting in the local community? Or how do we use positions at work to ask difficult questions that can try to create inclusive, equitable policies? So as we're coming to consciousness, it's like, all right, well, what are the different ways of acting? And then consulting with groups who would be impacted by those actions. So when you're acting, it's not just you yourself, but it's in community in a way.
And I would only add to that, thinking about avoiding a white savior complex and thinking about what that means, like what is the white savior complex, right? And how because I think that sometimes that it becomes there's an overrepresentation of it, right? So it's sometimes we're calling something white saviorism when that's not what it is. But I think that a lot of it comes down to reflexivity and positionality, right? Because white saviorism becomes when there's when a white person kind of self-congratulates themselves for doing the right thing, right? Or for not being racist. Give me a cookie, right? And it's like, that's the absolute bare minimum, right? So making sure that there is reflexivity that doing the right thing is just what we all owe each other as humans, and humanizing people who are different from us that's not necessarily a special thing. But the other thing that I think is important is, particularly I'm thinking about how white saviorism might emerge in a space where there's no people of color, right? Because people of color are good. Students of color often particularly progressive ones, are oftentimes really good at checking this in the moment and calling it out in the moment. And if there's no one there to call it out, then a group of white people that are doing good work can just be like, we're great, right? And so I think having some reflexivity, but also being careful and cautious about what you're speaking to, what you're speaking about, and making sure you're not speaking for, right? And this kind of goes back to what Rob was sharing. But I think that the danger only comes when someone, when there is, the offense comes when there is an attempt to represent or speak for an experience that is not yours, right? So you can speak about that and you can teach students about that, but you can't speak from that position. So I think that kind of constantly naming yourself to remind yourself and the people in the room who you are, right? And how you identify is a way of kind of doing a gut check of that all the time, right? And I'll do that in the classroom. Like, I don't have to announce myself as a Black woman, but I oftentimes have to announce myself as a cisgendered person who is an ally to queer folk and trans, but like making sure that you're kind of situating yourself is really helpful, and sometimes helps to remind yourself when you hear yourself say the thing and the students hear you. It's kind of a reminder that, okay, we are advocates for, but we are not proxies for, right?
So as a white man who thinks about these issues and tries to do the right thing, I'm very sensitive to this white savior complex, although I have to admit I'm hearing it for the first time, but I understand what it means. Yeah. And I gave statistics earlier on, examples of what corporate legal departments are doing and what law firms are doing. And we got to be honest, that's driven by profits. Mm-hmm. Firms want to represent these corporations, so they will do what the corporations are requiring them to do in order to land the new engagement. And corporations are motivated by their own bottom line and their shareholders and boards of directors. We hopefully will get to the point where we recognize and celebrate diversity because it's just the right thing to do and we need it. We are a diverse community. And we just got to do it because, again, it's the right thing to do, not because we want or need to make more money.
Thank you so much for that. And another question that kind of stood out that relates to this is going back to the conversation had earlier about what a typical lawyer looks like and how it can be difficult for those who are diverse to feel like they fit into what is available to them as mentors and as people in positions of power right now, to envision themselves as that typical lawyer. And so this question more specifically wanted to address pronouns and how often something that comes up is we refer to lawyers and judges using pronouns he, him. And this the person who posed the question talked about how much they enjoy when other pronouns are used, when we hear about female attorneys and lawyers, and why you think this is important, why pronouns have a place in this discussion about DEI.
I think gender inclusivity is really important in general, and trying to kind of neutralize, some of those assumptions about who gets to have particular positions of power. And so I think I definitely think that's important, because I think it is equally as important to think about the representation of women as potentially being lawyers and judges, but also the potentiality that gender nonconforming folk can do that too, right? So we're not just talking about how, there's this fictional mythical image of a white male judge or a white male lawyer that erases people of color, but it also erases, people of other identities and or abilities, right? So I think that being more gender inclusive is more representative of people who are gender expansive, who also deserve a part of a DEI conversation, right? So we oftentimes kind of assume diversity just means race and gender, but it means, or primarily race and cisgender identity, but it also includes, all of these other aspects of social identity and diversity as well. Because the problem with diversity is it becomes an umbrella term that means everything and therefore nothing, right? And so we forget what we're talking about. So I think it's important, because it's important for us to name, the individual identity differences that are being represented when we're talking about normality and what the mythical norm causes us to envision.
Yeah, I'm also thinking of how there's been texts, these germinal texts that we've read in classes. I'm thinking like Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and how a 1970s version would use he, him as pronouns. And then the 2000 or the newer edition starts to go back and rework and to be more inclusive of different gender pronouns used. And it makes me think, all right, well, if we're in a position where we write articles, we write case studies, whatever it might be, how we can consciously choose to use more inclusive gender pronouns. So that is one specific way to increase visibility to, or exposure to, presence of different gender pronouns in the way that we write. There's one other specific thing we could point to.
I'll never forget, I was a junior lawyer at my first law firm, and I was sensitive to this issue 25, 30 years ago. And I wrote a draft brief, and I referred to the person in the hypothetical as she or her. I mean, I'm sure I conjugated the sentence properly. And the partner, who was a very senior partner, changed it to him or his, and asked me why I said she and her. And I said, well, why do we have to say him or his? I mean, this is hypothetical, it's not a real person, right? So why don't we default to a woman? I lost that minor battle, but it was instructive. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it really does matter. It really matters what we write and what pronouns we use. Of course it matters. It matters on a personal level in order to show respect, but also to train people who are not sensitive to be more sensitive to the issue. Why is the default always a man? I mean, it's not right.
Right.
Thank you. Going on to another question. We've addressed what students should expect and ways faculty can help have these critical conversations about DEI. But one of these questions that stood out to me has to do with how administrators at law schools could support efforts to have more transparency from professors and have these conversations.
Mm. Mm. That makes me think about the difference between what can be done, when we think about like, what can we do starting today, like now forward or in the future, and what can we do to remedy things that are already existing and in place, right? And I think one of the unique things about an administrator is an administrator has, unlike a lot of other people within, an educational institution, an administrator can do both, right? And an administrator can put policies in place that will make things different and better moving forward. That might include, mandatory workshops for faculty, or because I think it's problematic to say start teaching DEI in your courses. That's the equivalent of April 2020, when everybody was told start teaching online and remotely, with no help, no context, no template, no experience, just do it. So I think one of the things that an administrator could enact is putting things in place so that professors can be trained on how to do that, right? So that they can have not just the advice that we're giving, but institutionally supported tools and resources and opportunities to do that. And I think they can also go back. There are things that an administrator has access to and resources that they have access to go back and remedy the wrong and remedy the things. And make it a better, kind of speaking to the students that came in, that are still there, but are not done, but came in on during a problematic process, and talk to them and get their advice. And maybe even reach out to people who have graduated and get their input and collaboration as well. So I think administrators have a lot of power, a lot of institutional power that they can leverage behind these initiatives. I don't think I know enough about the law school structure on its own to speak specifically about what they can do, because I'm trying not to put this in the context of like my college and the dean and the provost, but I think that, but I do know that they have reach both ways.
Yeah, I believe admin can also support faculty or professors, students who want to make a little adjustment to gender pronouns like Tom was doing. Is an admin would support Tom in doing that. Mm-hmm. Saying, yeah, of course, go for it. Mm-hmm. And then Robin, going back to what you're talking about earlier too, of, all right, if we're going to make this change, how do we invite people into a space, people who are minoritized in a space to then voice concerns, and admin's listening. Mm-hmm. So when the admin's making policies, those policies are reflecting some of those concerns.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, it makes me think about how we were talking about putting your money where your passion is, or where your focus is. And because I think another thing that is capable at the administrative level has to do with not just recruitment, but making space for, right? Like having, because I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying about trying not to have a student that becomes a token, because they become your diversity, and then you feel like you're done. Like, oh, we have a student of color, we're done, right? But rather, what does it mean to be intentional and have students plural of color, and build that into the structure and the foundation of your program, so that there are resources, there's funding specific to these students, that there is mentorship specific to these students, and that they are coming in together as a cohort and going through the program, and that there is at least a certain amount of seats in each incoming class that is devoted to that. That's an administrative flex, right? That can become, and because that's also something that can become embedded in the structure and how it's done, so that it can't be undone. If it becomes tethered to the structure, then somebody that comes behind them can't easily undo that and say, well, you're bringing in 10 diverse students a year on purpose. We're not doing that anymore. Like, no, if anything, they would build on it, right? So creating things that will make things easier and better, more equitable and safe, right, for these, because you can't bring diverse students in and then not know how to not treat them right and not have the things that they need. So but building things, having a vision for those things, and then making it so that it can't be undone, so that if anything, it only gets better and better and better over time.
Building off of this discussion we're having right now, I was hoping maybe Tom could address what you see with your background, understanding law from the corporate and the general counsel, as well as law firm side of things, like what you see as the needs of law school, administrators, but also, again, professors and students. Like, where does DEI need to go? Like, what could we be doing right now as law students to promote DEI once we're in the workforce in just a short number of years?
Boy, that's a tough question to answer. Obviously, raising awareness, demanding to be heard, demanding to have an opportunity. Those are all important things for law school students to do, and doing it when they're in some position of power, which is as they're applying for jobs, and firms and corporations are recruiting them. This is when they have some leverage. Unfortunately, currently, and it gets back to this white savior complex, a lot of these decisions still are driven by profits. Firms want companies to retain them. Companies are using carrots and sticks to address this issue, but while I think it's all well intentioned, I don't think it's driven by the inherent need to recognize and celebrate diversity. So law students do have a say in this process. I've certainly experienced changes that we've had to make because of issues that were raised by law students in law school or in the interviewing and recruiting process. So there is a role. There's no downside to being an advocate for these issues while you're in law school and as you're applying. I mean, if your audience is not receptive, if it's a firm or if it's a corporation that's not receptive, well, that's a data point for you in deciding whether you want to pursue that job or not. But unfortunately, it's still driven by, what is your leverage? If your goal is to get a job at a place and have them really celebrate you, you've got to have some reason to get them to listen, other than it just being fundamentally fair. Unfortunately, I wish that weren't the case, but I think it is still the case.
And I also, just to kind of add on to that, Victoria, I think that also, it's making me think of, I'm here at the University of Alabama, and we have, amazing student activists and who have done some amazing work that is made for some amazing change. But then I think about the weight and the toll of that, right? Because it makes me wonder how much responsibility should students, law students in particular, have to make these institutional changes, especially if they're putting all of this effort and time and energy into it to the point of literal exhaustion. But then they graduate, right? And it may be different, because if things are motivated by money, right, and we know that they are, it may be that, well, we now want your alumni dollars, so we'll but for the point of you going through the program and then graduating, because it's going to take you well, it might not take lawyers as long as it would take me, but because it'd take me a minute to be able to to have the dollars to woo them back. But it makes me think about if there has to be something structurally in place. This is why the administrative position is so important, because students graduate. And if the students behind you don't have the same passion for that thing, it's going to fall off. If it's not embedded in the structure, it's going to fall off. So it's like you could do a sit-in, you could do all of the things and make these demands. But by the time there's even a response to those demands, in some cases, you're about to graduate. So are you really going to stay that committed and tethered to the law school when you're out here now trying to get your career going? So what would it mean if there was some kind of structural organization that students can be involved in, but that it's not just student generated, because students graduate. And so unless you have incoming students, they're going to pick up the mantle. And also, I want to reiterate that I don't think they should have to, right? It's not a student's responsibility to fix these institutions that they didn't break, right? Especially when they're fighting. It's like, you shadow boxing, you're going to exhaust yourself, and it's going to be the same thing when you leave, right? Or it's going to go right back to how it was after you're gone. So kind of keeping that in mind, I just I want students to be proactive and progressive, but also protect themselves, because, I just feel like it could take a whole lot of heart, and then you look back 5 years later and it's the exact same, kind of like Tom was saying, things haven't changed much since since you were in law school. And I think that's going to, that it would be devastating to do all of that and then look back, and then it's reverted right back, right? So it should be student centered, but it can't be the student's responsibility.
I'm so appreciative that you spoke up and added that thought in there. I think that was a really great thing to say. I want to be cognizant, though, of the time that we have left for this panel. Thank you so much, Dr. Boylorn, Dr. Rosante, Tom Donnelly, for your thoughts. I want to give you each about a minute to express any final thoughts you might have on overcoming resistance to DEI, and then we'll conclude the session.
I have talked a lot, and I'm sorry, but I'm a talker. I'm a comm professor. Commentator is the thing that I do. But I just want to kind of encourage stamina. It takes stamina. This is exhausting, emotionally weighty work, and you have to be really committed to it in the long term, right? But as you are resisting it, take care of yourself. I'm like obsessed with self-care right now. So I just want, I want to advise everybody to fight hard, rest harder. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and I'll add, building off of Robin's last comment there of students, there's things that we can do, students, but then administrators are things that we can do. And I think of who might be out there, those administrative architects who are doing this work. And it's easy to point, oh, people are failing here, and there. But it could also be helpful to look at, well, who are those administrators who are starting to create and rework and promote DEI, and keeping an eye, just observing what they're doing to maybe to serve as a model for us. And yeah, thank you all for having us.
So while we've made not enough progress in the last 30 years, we've made some progress. So that's encouraging. I do think we'll make more progress because of fora like this and how passionate this panel is, and I'm sure the students are about these issues. So I do think there's the possibility for fundamental change. The key, law students, is to find mentors in faculty, in your colleagues, in law firms, in corporations and nonprofits. Find mentors, network, get out there, get involved so that you make those personal connections. Because getting back to what Rob said, it begins at the micro level. And that hopefully over time is going to effectuate change. But even if not, you'll at least find your support group as you go through this. And I wish you all the best. And thank you very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much again to our panelists, and thank you to everyone in the audience. We did not even make a dent in the number of questions asked, but I find that really encouraging because that means obviously that these are conversations that will continue to happen here and in other spaces about DEI. This concludes our session. Thank you so much, everyone in attendance. Thank you.